Hello, fellow aviators. Mage Leader here. I know what you're all thinking. What in the actual fuck has happened to the mech bay? Rest assured, it hasn't gone anywhere. Don't be alarmed, but I may have slipped a little something into your Timbiki Dark last night and dragged you away to a new location against your will. Why? Well, first, because I've always secretly wanted to try my hand at negotiating a ransom, and second, because I found something incredibly cool that I wanted to share with you. Welcome to Ancient Terra. The year is 1937, and we're in a wacky little country known as the Maritime Provinces. This is the world of zeppelins and daring fighter aces, the age of the sky pirates. This is Crimson Skies. Back in what I am frequently assured was the good old days, there was an obscure little company known as FASA, and they made a few underground little indie titles that I'm sure you've never heard of. Little things like Battletech and Shadowrun. Alright, look, there's no overstating just how big of a deal Battletech was back then. The IP had an allure that was virtually unrivaled, and FASA had quite the bombshell on their hands. It was a smash hit, with whole division set up for the tabletop game, the RPG counterpart, and a solid run of video games, not to mention dedicated VR experiences. People still have fond memories of FASA's properties, but Crimson Skies is largely forgotten. If you bring it up, the fans will come out of the woodwork, but on a day-to-day basis, it's all but invisible. Well, if you ask me, that's just plain unacceptable! And so today I'll be trying to remedy that somewhat. So without any further ado, let's just dive right in. So what is Crimson Skies? Well, simply put, Crimson Skies is an alternate history setting, a beautiful amalgamation of interwar technological innovation. It's a time when men and women had class, dressed like absolute chads, spoke with dry wit, and drew up some of the greatest depictions of the female form to ever grace a canvas. It's an age of swashbuckling heroics, where the heightened reality of classic pulp and radio dramas is the status quo, and one where any man can make his mark on the world, not to mention the hearts of a dozen adoring dames. It's a place of larger-than-life heroes and dastardly villains, where noble duels in the skies of North America determine who rises to glory and who goes down in flames. Imagine the romanticized myth of the mech warrior, then trade his battle mech for a plane, swap the metal music for swing and soul, and you've got yourself the essence of Crimson Skies. Set in a fractured version of the United States, the world of Crimson Skies is dominated by mighty airships and the people who fly them, and it all begins with a rift in history. Nobody knows precisely when the division began, but everyone can see when it all came to a head. The states that comprised the USA were no strangers to disagreement. Hell, it wasn't even the first time they'd separated. Many say that the old wounds of the Civil War had never truly healed, but the insular nature of the present has its strongest roots in the ashes of the Great War. Many Americans had protested joining the war in Europe that had begun in 1914. Indeed, the United States had sat out a large chunk of the conflict, but ultimately, the American public would be dragged kicking and screaming into war with the Central Powers, and the results would be devastating. Not the war itself, mind you. While an entire generation of young American men would return home forever changed, the war itself was fought on foreign soil. But with so many men returning from the front, something more deadly than 1,000 howitzers returned with them. An influenza epidemic racked the United States, and the nation went into harsh quarantine. States shut down their borders, federal infrastructure programs were placed on hold and eventually canceled. The states became isolated and were forced to be self-reliant during the crisis. The power of the federal government continued to dwindle as their inability to handle the crisis increasingly made the states less and less dependent on their leadership. Worse yet, the war and ensuing epidemic left the treasury of the United States virtually empty, and returning American soldiers were left unpaid for their service, leading to widespread discontent among the armed forces. Even when the epidemic passed, the market left on the country was indelible, and it would soon come to a head once again. From 1920 to 1923, the issue of prohibition is hotly debated in Congress, but the bill continues to lose traction. Regionalist factions within the government are staunchly opposed to any federal ban, and ultimately the issue is left for the states to resolve for themselves. The result is similar to issues of the previous century, with states determining themselves as either dry or wet states. Illicit trade and bootlegging runs rampant across the continent, with many organized criminals making a fortune off the smuggling of alcohol. In response, the states tighten their security, expanding their police and militia forces to counteract the growing wave of crime. In 1924, the Bluefield Incident occurs. A series of skirmishes between state militias in the Appalachian Mountains shake the very foundation of the Union. Local militias are now large enough to be a force unto themselves, and the U.S. Army was too entangled with troubles of its own to intervene. Virginia's National Guard captured a convoy of Kentucky National Guardsmen attempting to smuggle alcohol from Kentucky to West Virginia through the mountains. Despite the matter being under Kentucky's jurisdiction, Virginia refused to extradite the prisoners, and instead tried and convicted the men in their own courts. What followed was 2 years of Cold War between 4 different states, with numerous armed incidents on their borders. In the end, the U.S. Army pulled itself together just long enough to convince Virginia to release the prisoners in 1926, a full 2 years after their capture. The crisis had nearly broken out into full-on armed conflict, and faith in the authority of the federal government continued to wane. In 1927, a second outbreak of influenza once again rocked the continent. States went into lockdown even harder than before, closing their borders to all ground traffic. Militias and private armed security companies now manned checkpoints at the lines between each state, and for a brief moment the illicit trade of alcohol ground to a halt. The bootleggers were caught off guard by the rapid increase in security, but fortunately for them, technology had come to the rescue. By 1927, aircraft had gone from a dangerous marvel of engineering to a reliable way to ship cargo, and soon the use of planes became the preferred method of border jumping. A new class of anti-hero began to emerge as their daring airborne missions began to capture the attention and imagination of the public. The final blow for the Union came in 1929. The stock market collapsed, and so did the country. Companies folded, millionaires became paupers overnight, and entire regions were effectively bankrupted. Unemployment swept the country, and the states quailed beneath the crumbling economy. Texas was the first state to have had its fill, and seceded, followed rapidly by the others. Some states banded together into coalitions, others stood alone. In the West, Native American tribes seized the opportunity to rise up and drive away white settlers from their lands, giving rise to ethno-states within the continent and the islands of Hawaii. What remained of the United States government diminished until it became the virtually powerless nation of Colombia, a neutral ground for the other emerging nations to conduct diplomacy. With the fracturing and balkanization of the United States came great upheaval, and the years of lockdowns and border hopping had created intense resentment between states. This now gave rise to armed conflict, and the mutual distrust led to the sabotage of railways and roads as warfare began to grip the continent, and the merchants of the U.S. had to find new ways of moving their products. Much like the bootleggers, they turned to the skies. The Zeppelin had been something of a fad in Europe, but in the United States, it quickly became the default means of moving men and material. Cargo and passengers were moved across the continent in these elegant airborne giants, and the automobile was soon eclipsed by the modern wonder that was the airship. But like any ship, they soon came across a new threat. The American continent is a massive stretch of land, one of the largest in the world, and vast swaths of it remained unsettled even in the 1930s. Large sections were virtually lawless, the perfect breeding ground for criminal gangs who already had a presence in the air. With the advent of sky travel came the birth of sky piracy, and with it the romantic age of crimson skies truly began. The year is now 1937, and the battles of the air now dominate life in America, both economically and culturally. The airman is the armored knight of the 20th century, with his daring and skill in battle often making the difference between life and death. Famous pilots are more popular than movie stars, and their lives are glamorized in every form of media. Heroes like Paladin Blake, Loyal Crawford, and Charlie Steele clash with rogues like Nathan Zachary, Jonathan Kahn, and the mysterious Black Swan. Pirates, privateers, and security companies battle it out in the air, much like the famed galleon hunters of the 17th century. It is an age of high adventure, where fame and fortune are seized at gunpoint, and it's glorious. Now that I have your attention, let's get into it just a little deeper. Crimson Skies has always been something of a backseat project from FASA. While the board game was released, the initial concept and final intended product had always been the video game market, and the marketing push for Crimson Skies on PC was impressive for the time. The game had been in the concept phase for years, and as it finally got the green light, a multimedia marketing push ensued. Short stories, novels, in and out of universe advertisements, and even a full-on radio drama were produced, with plans for a run of comic books actively proceeding. For a time, Crimson Skies was everywhere. The game was developed by Zipper Interactive, the same company that made the excellent MechWarrior 3. With cooperation from FASA Studio, the PC game began to take shape. Though plagued with development troubles, it would eventually release on September 18, 2000 to general acclaim. While not a smash hit, it developed a passionate following. The PC game follows the exploits of Nathan Zachary and his pirate gang, the Fortune Hunters. Nathan is a cocky, suave, and capable pilot who leads his crew on adventures around the continent, clashing with rival pirates, security companies, and militias as they search for the lost treasure of Sir Francis Drake, rescue scientists from Soviet spies, and uncover a conspiracy to dominate the disunited states. It's an adventure pulled straight from the pages of pulp magazines, with Nathan swashbuckling his way through both battles and bedrooms with equal efficiency. Like Errol Flynn with wings, you'll dogfight to victory in a series of thrilling missions. The game is good. So good, in fact, that I may give it a dedicated video in the future. For now, suffice to say that it's a damn good time, and if you can get it running, you should. The game got a sequel in 2003 with Crimson Skies: High Road to Revenge, a more arcade-like experience for the original Xbox that, while different from its predecessor, is no less enjoyable. Once again, Nathan Zachary takes to the sky in a hub-based set of missions that explore the world of Crimson Skies in even greater depth. The game is a roaring good time with perhaps the single most underrated soundtrack in all of video games. If you own any Xbox console, you can and should play the game via backwards compatibility. I found a copy at my local used game store for $5, which is an absolute steal. Do yourself a favor and give it a play. So, with all this amazing content to enjoy, where is Crimson Skies today? Well, that's an excellent question. Despite being literally the coolest thing ever, Crimson Skies, if you'll excuse the pun, never really took off. While a mild success, it never quite managed to garner mainstream appeal. While the 90s had seen a brief resurgence of pulp, the early 2000s was dominated by punk music, Tony Hawk, and counterculture. Crimson Skies was a love letter to a bygone era, one that failed to land in the cultural zeitgeist of the time, despite its quality. While it certainly had its fans, it was never enough to sustain it in a world where being cool was directly tied to one's ability to land skateboard tricks and wear their baseball cap backwards. Man, people actually listened to Smash Mouth and Fred Durst unironically back then. Fuck me, that's embarrassing. Somebody. Crimson Skies would get a miniatures game under WizKids, who, in an unprecedented move for a FASA property, actually decided not to fuck up the setting. While not a wild success, it's a fun game with a small but dedicated community. That's right, Crimson Skies is possibly the only FASA property that actually improved under WizKids. Sadly, this wasn't enough, and the property has laid dormant ever since. If ever there was a fictional setting with untapped potential, it's this one. The background, in typical FASA fashion, is rich and detailed. The world is well conceived and brimming with possibilities. It's got no less than 22 different factions vying for power, and that's just in North America. Perhaps I'll make a video covering them in a bit more detail soon. It's perfect for customized experiences, with the opportunity to create a unit of your own from top to bottom. You could play anything from noble pirates and private security firms all the way to bloodthirsty plunderers and everything in between. Perfect for those of us who enjoyed making our own Space Marine chapters in 40k or mercenary companies in Battletech. One of the best achievements of Crimson Skies, however, is something that a lot of other game settings should learn from. Crimson Skies is a setting that doesn't move. It's not an ongoing saga. Instead, it's content to be a static backdrop for emergent storytelling. The story is what happens on the game board. It's a set of rules for the player to operate within and let their imaginations run wild. No new sourcebooks erasing your favorite faction from the world, no overpowered new tech, no DEI-infested company trying to retcon beloved characters to fit their modern politics. The year is 1937. What happens next is up to you. Enjoy the badass airships before the technology of World War II puts the final nail in the coffin of romanticism. The world of Crimson Skies is a tabletop fan's wet dream, the perfect place for a passionate community to flourish. It's practically begging for a tabletop RPG, and the fact that no official one was ever made is borderline criminal. However, the passionate community surrounding Crimson Skies has adapted some homebrew materials for it using the Savage Worlds rule set, and other endeavors are ripe for the picking. The fans still organize online play for the video games and are immensely helpful in tracking down the physical game materials as well. There's a whole community around 3D printing miniatures. Best of all, it's a place where discussion of the game itself trumps anything else. Nobody's going to come along and strong-arm the production company into political bullshit because the only new content is fan-made. Like an oasis in a vast desert, it's a place that's almost completely free of any real-world drama. A world that you can just enjoy as it is. This is the final point I want to ram home. Crimson Skies is a living proof that a community run by fans is one that resists outside influence. Those who are truly passionate about the hobby take the best care of it. The political takeover that is currently failing to claim Battletech can't even begin to touch Crimson Skies, and it's a beautiful thing. So after all this rambling, I want to cap this all off by saying that Crimson Skies is rapidly becoming a new obsession for me. It's not going to replace Battletech as first in my heart, nothing ever will, but I'm thrilled to add it to the list of things that I love. In a time where everything is turning to shit, I urge you to return with me to a simpler time, to a world that wrote a love letter to the heroes of the past, a place where pulp reigns supreme, where the men are dashing and the dames are beautiful, and the call of adventure draws everyone to the skies. If you'd like to dive into this world with me, I've included a link to a wonderful little Discord server in the description. I hope to see you all in the air. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, this is Mage Leader, signing off.